Hey friend, in this tutorial, we are going to be painting a beautiful bearded iris. I am obsessed with this flower. It's one of my favorites to paint. It's also one of the more challenging loose style florals to paint. So I'm gonna break it down in a really simplistic way by something I think you might find a little shocking. And it might have to do with a article of clothing. Mystery. So stick till the end so you know exactly what I'm talking about and how to actually paint a bearded iris and break it down into simple forms and color mixing and wet and wet technique. We're also painting a vintage porcelain French style vase in this tutorial, which is super fun. Kind of a little twist on what I typically do or what you maybe typically do. So if you're ready, let's dive in. Okay, so we're gonna be painting a bearded iris, a loose style bearded iris. And there's a lot of different color combos with bearded irises. This is like all time one of the most unique and beautiful flowers that I think has ever existed. It's like so beautiful. So we are gonna paint one and it's gonna be loose. And what we're gonna do first is I have my reference photo pulled up, and what I do when I'm painting a loose flower is I look at the colors first. So I kind of note to myself, okay, we've got some brown undertones in our purples down here, some brown, maybe some yellow ochre, and then a really light pale wash of opera rose, yellow ochre, maybe mostly water. But a lot of our undertones in these colors are similar to skin tones. We're going to use yellow ochre and brown umber as our undertones for our purple area, and then our like really light peachy area with this burst of cadmium orange in the middle for our stamen area. But this bearded iris, the shape of it, we're going to go for an upside down cone shape or like a vase shape right here for the petals that are pointing upwards. And then downwards, we just have these heart-shaped flowers. So we have, or petals. So we have a heart-shaped petal here that we see the full heart. And then this is just the side of the heart with a lot of frilly textured edges, which is gonna be fun to paint. So I'm gonna move my reference photo over to the side. You can pull up the same one. I just have this on Pinterest. We can link to it if you guys wanna use the same one. So you can pull up the same one if you want to, or reference another photo of a bearded iris that has colors that you really like. But what we're gonna do first is actually paint a vase. So I'm gonna start with just water on my size 16 brush. All of the supplies are linked in the description below. These are my all-time favorite supplies. The brushes I use are Princeton Heritage 4050 brushes. They're synthetic sable, they're very flexible, they hold a lot of good water, and are just really great for painting, especially loose florals. So I love these brushes. Linked below if you need them. I'm gonna paint an area of like a tall half of an oval shape for my vase over here on the left section of my paper. And I'm gonna have my iris kind of falling right here and maybe some leaves. So this is decently wet because then we're just gonna grab some blues. I'm gonna grab some Prussian blue and maybe some cobalt blue from my palette. And I am going to just use the tip of my brush and poke in some Prussian blue. Maybe lighten some of it. You can also just use water droplets and that will create a fun little like starburst texture when it dries. So I'm just creating this like French porcelain vintage vase look, but it's all blurry because we're painting wet and wet. I paint wet and wet all the time. So if you don't know what wet and wet is, or you need more practice with wet and wet, I use wet and wet in most of my tutorials, if not all. But we have a full-on tutorial for you just on wet and wet and all the various techniques for wet and wet that you can use. So make sure you check out that video. We'll link to it. Okay, so blurry vase effect. Nothing crazy to look at here. It's just wet and wet, and it's just a beautiful, you know, subtle nod to that vintage French porcelain vase, white and blue porcelain. Okay, so what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna start with my size 6 brush to paint my iris. So this iris in my reference photo is facing directly toward me. So we see the full heart shape of this petal right here, and we see an opening in the middle where we can see into the heart of the flower, the middle of the flower. So I'm going to start with my heart-shaped petal first, but we need to mix up our colors. So what we're gonna do is, I see some tones of purple, especially in here, the center top of the petal right here, and it's lighter, and then it gets like a darker dusty violet down there, or purple. So we've got some ultramarine violet. I'm gonna mix it with some burnt umber and maybe a little yellow ochre. I already had some burnt umber in my mixing well right here, so we're just going for it because we're type B. And by we, I mean me. I want to warm this up a tad, so I'm going to use Opera Rose for a touch of pink. Make it a little bit more of a warm, dusty purple. Warm, dusty purple. Right there is my mixture. So we used ultramarine violet, burnt umber, yellow ochre, and a touch of Opera Rose. That's going to be the color I use after the color in the center, which is just going to be ultramarine violet and maybe a touch of Opera Rose for a warm purple. And I want just a little bit of yellow ochre so blend well with the muted effect. Okay. So I'm going to start with that purple mixture I have, and I'm just going to lay down a little, I don't even know what to call this, what the technical term would be, but just a little swatch right there with the side of my brush. And then I am going to rinse off all of that pigment from my brush just to pull this down like a gradient with the side of my brush. So using wet and wet to pull this down kind of in a spear shape, like an arrow shape, like so. And I want to make sure that that stays decently wet, but it's not too wet where it's going to create a weird hard line effect when it dries. So now I got my spear. I'm going to go and move over to my dusty purple color, and we're going to pull out that heart shape. So I'm going right on that edge, especially while it's still wet, so I have this soft gradient mix. And maybe add a touch more purple to some of it. Build up that mixture a little bit more. So now I'm just going to use the side of my brush. So I'm really, really low to my paper. I'm about 25 degrees away from the paper with the handle of my brush. And I'm just going to fan it out. And kind of twist the hair of my brush as I'm pulling it out, because these bearded iris have crazy texture on the edges. And while this is still wet, I'm going to go back in and darken some of these areas, so don't you worry. So I'm going to go back with this purple mixture and darken here. Grab more of my dusty purple, maybe mix up a little bit more of it. And go up on the edges here. And there's this little crease on my reference photo right here that I'm just going to add a little depth right there. So I'm just going around the edges with my darker color and then pulling in a line. Dried off my brush now, And while these areas that I just painted are still wet, I'm just going with a dry brush and helping it blend a little softer. So I'm kind of soaking up some of that pigment. And then going back while these areas are still wet, rolling it in. Going in with my dry brush and softening.
Wow. That looks good.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. It's crazy to watch it come to life.
Dude, you should do a takeover and try this one. I would love to see that.
Oh my goodness, that stresses me out thinking about it.
It's really not as difficult as it looks, but you gotta have an eye for where those creases are, so having a reference photo is helpful.
That's the thing, the creases look crazy.
Okay, and then I'm gonna go back to that center area with the purple. And it's drying kind of funky right here, so I want to pull it in a little bit more. And this is a loose style iris, so we're not, painting the exact replica of our reference photo, but we're using it as a shape reference, as color palette reference. I'm going to go in with a dry brush and kind of soak up some of this dark patch, so it's only in the crease. So since we're painting a loose style iris, I also have a realistic style iris tutorial in my book, Everyday Watercolor Flowers, which is on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, in smaller bookstores, local bookstores. So check it out. We have a realistic bearded iris tutorial in there. Okay, so while this is still slightly wet, this top center area of my petal, I'm just gonna poke in some cadmium orange with a touch of Scarlet Lake for that. I believe that's the stamen of the iris. And we are going to just plop right there. I want it to bleed, but it didn't because that's dry right there, so I'm just going to make it do that myself by adding some water and just doing these little brushing your teeth motions, as I like to call them. So we've got a little touch of a bleed with that orange, which I love that about loose style painting. And we're gonna go back and add some more detail to this later. But we're gonna move on to our frilly, I like to call this part of the iris the skirt. It is the skirt because it's really like a flamenco skirt, I think is what it's called.
That sounds right.
But it's upside down. So we're painting a flamenco skirt, but upside down and in petals. So there's multiple sections of fabric on our flamenco skirt, if you know what I'm saying. So these are really light petals. I'm gonna use some yellow ochre and some opera rose. And that's all you need for this. Maybe a touch of lemon yellow deep. But you're gonna need a lot of water for these. So I'm gonna start with the mixture on my brush, and you can either rinse it off in your water cup to get just a touch of it on your brush and a lot of water, or you can continue to add water to your palette like this if you want to do it that way. I'm only picking up a tiny bit of pigment on my brush, and it's already super watered down, but I just want a little bit more water. So we're not wasting paint, we're not wasting too much paint, but if you want to add more water to it, you can. So what we're gonna do here is I'm gonna grab higher up on my brush because these petals or this flamenco skirt is really expressive, and I'm not sitting there doing every little detail really tight, really close. So I like to, when I'm being more expressive with my strokes, I like to back it up a little bit with my brush and hold really high, but do whatever's comfortable for you. So we want to make sure that we have a good amount of water on our brush and so that it stays really flexible. And I'm basically just going to follow the frills and the movement of the skirt, the outline of the skirt first. So I'm just kind of moving my brush along like that. And then I'm going to grab my darker pigment and pull up the back side of that petal. And we can go in, and again, we're using this as a reference. So I'm just going to go in, and I want this to be darker here. So I'm using wet and wet painting to make that stand out a little bit. Drying my brush off, softening. Then maybe I'll go in here on this crease with a darker yellow ochre situation. Pull out that edge and soften it with the dry brush. Watercolor is all about patience, whether you're painting a loose style or you're painting in a realistic style. It's all about patience and movement. I want this orange to bleed a little more, so I'm just going to re-wet it with some more orange. Boom. That's cute. We like that. Let it do its thing. Coming back over to my light flamenco skirt mixture and doing the other side of the skirt. Again, starting with the top of the petal, the frilly area. So I'm pointing and grabbing up higher, pointing and curving around. So this section of the skirt is dancing this way, or maybe it's going up a little bit more. And then we're pulling down the back side, and then maybe we have another smaller petal poking out here and in the middle. Get that turn. So we're just, and I'm leaving some white space between my petals as I'm dancing around so that it looks like multiple petals. Maybe adding a petal over here. And then going back in and adding the depth, the creases. This petal is probably going to be our darkest one because it's in the middle and overshadowed by these. Wet, dry. Darkening the back side of this petal so it stands out a little more. Maybe adding some pink or yellow ochre to some of these spots. And now doing the dusty purple side petals. Same style. If you want a really dark, vibrant purple, Prussian blue will really punch it in the face. Make it darker. I'm gonna add Opera Rose to it. So I really want my shadows to start punching. Punched you in the face. So with this front petal, I'm gonna go in with my size 2, grab that dark color I just mixed up, dab it on my paper towel a little, and go into my creasy areas and pull out these really thin lines. Just a few. And we'll do the same thing with our lighter color, but darken the value just a little bit more on that with Opera Rose and Yellow Ochre. So less water will make for a darker pigment. And we're just gonna pull out some thinner strokes on our petals. Not a ton. Basically following the curve of the petal. So this petal right here is pointing straight up and down, so my middle is going to be right there, and then I start to curve and fan.
Fern and fan.
Curve my way like a fan on that petal. So you're basically, with your thin lines, you're following the curve of the outside edge of each petal. So for the thin lines on the right side of my petal, I'm curving this way because that's the curve of this edge of the petal, the right edge. The left edge is curving that way, so the left strokes are going that way.
This just might be my favorite flower you've done for the channel so far.
Really?
I think so. This is really cool.
It was a last minute addition.
I know.
We can get even just these little fine lines on edges that are really, really light, so we can show the viewer, yes, there is some petal here. Bearded iris. Now our final detail on the flower before we add the stem and leaves is going to be to really make this stamen area punch. So if you look closely at the reference photo, there's little spikies on it that are a darker reddish orange. So I'm going to grab Scarlet Lake and some cadmium orange, and there's very little water on my brush, so I can make this a thicker, darker mixture. I'm using my size 2 brush, and I've got about a 35-degree angle on my brush, little to no pressure, so I create thin strokes. And we're just going to add these spikies. I want it to be a little less red and more orange, so. We want to leave areas of that base showing though. It's just an easy way to do something that looks really detailed, but it's really not that complicated. Okay, now that our flower is done, we're gonna paint in. I'm gonna do my stem kind of like this, and then we're gonna have leaves shooting off. You can even add a bud up in the top right corner if you want to. Composition wise, we're talking leading people's eyes through our piece with negative space and using the rule of thirds. So if you were to basically take your sheet of paper and break it up into 9 sections, so you've got your top 3, middle 3, and then your bottom 3 sections, vertical, 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 same thing. You want your main focal point to be somewhere on those intersection points or in the middle section. So we've got our main focal point. This main subject is the iris. In that middle section, it doesn't need to be direct center, and it really shouldn't unless you're being really intentional about it. So we've got our movement or our main positive space happening in the left section of our paper. Now I want to lead people's eyes to the right section of the paper in the opposite corner. So we're going from left in kind of like this C curve, which is just a natural subconscious way that your eyes like to look at things. So I'm grabbing my size 6 brush, and I'm gonna do a more yellow-green. The reason for that is we have a lot of warm hues up here with our purples, our peaches, our peachy, dusty peach situation here, and then we have a nod to our cool colors down here. But I wanna brighten it up just a little bit with a brighter yellow-green. You can do a bluer green, you can do a more like army green or a sage green if you want to, and it will totally change the look of the piece. But I'm wanting something to be a little bit more of a pop to bring this forward, because all of my leaves are going to be in the background of my flower, so I'm going to go behind it. So I want it to be like a lighter yellow green, just kind of floating for my stem. Using my size 6 brush for that. Maybe we've got a subtle leaf situation happening here. So for these leaves, I am using the side of my brush. So I've got a 35-degree angle on my brush. And I'm just pressing just a little bit, kind of waving it around, and then getting really thin, just using the tip of my brush for that. I'm painting a little bud situation here. If you need help with painting leaves, I have a few tutorials on a bunch of different leaves, and in one of those tutorials I show you how to paint a longer strip type of leaf, kind of like an iris leaf. That will help you with this tutorial. So I've got the majority of my stems and leaves coming this way because, again, we're leading people's eyes through here, but I still want just a couple on the left side too to help frame the piece. We're gonna just do a bud, so it's just an oval shape here, not too big though, with my light color first and some water. I like that green to bleed into it. And I'm gonna grab some of my purple just to add some outline to that peachy color and some strokes in there where there's just so much going on in this little bud you couldn't even imagine all the detail. But we're just nodding to it. And then I'm blending it with a dry brush. And let's bring in some more of that yellow green. Kind of give that bud a little hug. And we are almost done. I just have this gap of negative space here that's just a little too open for me, so I'm just gonna have that. And we can call this a day. If you want, you can go back on your vase and add a little bit more detail to it, like it's a florally pattern. Just going to there you go. A bearded iris.
Bravo, master.
Thanks so much for watching. I hope that was helpful for you. Please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already and turn on notifications. That's how you'll be notified immediately when we release our next tutorial. We post twice a week, videos twice a week. So you'll never miss when we post one. And you know, algorithms these days, people are missing them all the time. So make sure you subscribe and turn on those notifications. Comment below with maybe another flower that you would love to see on this channel. Maybe we've covered it already and can point you towards a video, or maybe you haven't seen it yet and you'd love to see a tutorial on that flower. And I would love to do the tutorial for you. Also, to bring up again, my book, Everyday Watercolor Flowers, is linked below if you want to learn how to do a realistic style bearded iris. So we did the loose version today. If you want to learn the more realistic version, go purchase my book and support your favorite artist on Amazon or wherever you have a bookseller near you that sells the book. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.